I met Matthew Collins at a small art gallery opening in downtown Seattle 3 years after his life completely imploded. He was standing in front of a watercolor painting of a Thai beach, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped a plastic cup of cheap wine. When I approached him, I noticed the deep lines around his eyes, the kind that come not from age, but from sleepless nights and endless regret. What I didn't know then was that I was looking at a man who had lost everything in just 4 months. A man whose story would haunt me long after he finished telling it. Matthew had been the kind of guy everyone envied: successful architect, beautiful wife, Sarah, two teenage kids who actually still talk to their parents. But sometimes the people who seem to have it all are the ones most vulnerable to losing everything. And if you think you could never fall for what happened to him, well, that's exactly what Matthew thought too. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because what you're about to hear will change how you think about trust, love, and the dangerous territory between them. Matthew Collins was 52 when his world started unraveling. Though he didn't know it yet, he had built his architectural firm from nothing, working 18-hour days for 20 years until he could afford the house in Bellevue, the private schools for Emma and Jake, the annual family vacations that Sarah meticulously planned. He was the kind of father who never missed a soccer game, never forgot an anniversary, never questioned whether the life he'd built was the life he actually wanted. That changed during what was supposed to be their best family vacation yet. Sarah had booked 2 weeks in Thailand, splitting time between Bangkok's cultural sites and the beaches of Surat Thani. It was her dream trip, something she'd been planning for 3 years, complete with itineraries printed in color-coded folders and restaurant reservations made months in advance. Matthew went along because that's what good husbands do, even though he'd rather have spent his vacation time working on the Morrison project back home. The first week went exactly as Sarah had planned. They toured temples, took cooking classes, and Emma actually put down her phone long enough to take family photos. Jake, 17 and perpetually annoyed by everything, even smiled a few times. Matthew played his role perfectly, the devoted family man capturing memories on his camera, buying souvenirs he'd never look at again, pretending the humid heat and crowded markets energized rather than exhausted him. But something was eating at him, something he couldn't name. Maybe it was turning 52 and realizing he spent more time thinking about retirement than about living. Maybe it was watching Sarah plan every moment of their lives with military precision while he felt like a passenger in his own existence. Maybe it was the growing distance he felt from his kids, who seemed to need him less each year. Whatever it was, Matthew felt hollow inside, going through the motions of a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty within. The second week was supposed to be pure relaxation on the beaches of Surat Thani. Sarah had booked a family-friendly resort with activities for the kids and spa treatments for herself. Matthew looked forward to finally having some time to think, to maybe figure out why success felt so much like failure these days. He had no idea that his moment of clarity would come in a way that would destroy everything he'd spent his life building. On their third day at the resort, while Sarah was getting a massage and the kids were parasailing, Matthew decided to take a walk along the beach. He needed solitude, needed to escape the cheerful resort atmosphere and the constant family togetherness that was starting to feel suffocating. The beach stretched for miles in both directions, mostly empty except for a few local vendors and the occasional tourist couple taking selfies. That's when he saw her. Vilai was sitting alone on a piece of driftwood, sketching in a small notebook, completely absorbed in her work. She couldn't have been more than 25, with long black hair that caught the afternoon sunlight and moved gently in the ocean breeze. There was something about her concentration, the way she held her pencil, that reminded Matthew of himself when he used to draw building designs by hand, before everything became digital, before creativity became just another business process. He almost walked past her, should have walked past her, but something made him stop. Maybe curiosity about what she was drawing. Maybe just the desire to talk to someone who wasn't part of his carefully orchestrated family vacation. When he approached, she looked up with eyes that seemed genuinely surprised and pleased to see him. Not the practiced smile of someone in the tourist industry. Her English was careful but clear, accented in a way that made every word sound deliberate and important. She was sketching the old fishing boats pulled up on the shore, she explained, trying to capture the way the weathered wood told stories of storms survived and catches brought home. Matthew found himself sitting beside her on the sand, watching her work, feeling something stir in him that had been dormant for years. They talked for an hour, maybe more. She asked him about architecture, seemed genuinely fascinated by his descriptions of designing buildings that would outlast their creators. He asked about her art, learned she taught elementary school, but dreamed of studying in Europe, of seeing the great galleries and learning from masters whose names she pronounced with reverent care. There was something about the way she listened, really listened, that made Matthew feel heard in a way he hadn't experienced in years. When he finally returned to the resort, Sarah asked where he'd been, with the casual concern of a wife who trusted her husband completely. Matthew told her he'd taken a long walk, which was technically true, and felt the first small crack in his integrity open up inside his chest. He told himself it was harmless, just a conversation with a friendly local, nothing more. But that night, lying in the resort bed, listening to Sarah's peaceful breathing and Jake's occasional snores from the adjoining room, Matthew couldn't stop thinking about Vilai's laugh, the way she touched his arm when making a point about art being the only universal language. He couldn't stop thinking about how young and alive she'd seemed, how talking to her had made him feel young and alive too. Now I want you to pause this story for a moment and think about what's happening here. Put yourself in Matthew's shoes and tell me in the comments what seems suspicious or concerning about this situation so far. What red flags, if any, do you see that Matthew might be missing in his current emotional state? The next morning, Matthew told his family he wanted to explore the local area, maybe find some authentic architecture to photograph for his portfolio. Sarah was happy to spend the day at the resort spa with Emma, and Jake was content with the hotel's gaming lounge and pool. For the first time in the vacation, everyone seemed pleased with the plan to split up. Matthew walked the same stretch of beach, telling himself he was just enjoying the solitude. But his heart rate quickened when he saw Vilai in almost the exact same spot, sketching again. This time she was drawing the palm trees that leaned over the water, their fronds creating intricate patterns of shadow and light. She seemed as genuinely pleased to see him as she had the day before. And this time their conversation lasted the entire afternoon. She told him about her family, her parents who worked in the rice fields, her younger brother who was studying engineering in Bangkok. She spoke about her dreams with a passion that reminded Matthew of his own young ambitions. back when designing buildings felt like creating art rather than just solving problems for wealthy clients. Matthew found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in years, maybe decades. He told her about the projects he was most proud of, but also about the ones that kept him awake at night, the compromises he'd made for money, the creative visions sacrificed to client demands and building codes. He told her about feeling trapped in a life that looked perfect but felt like a beautifully designed prison. Villi listened with an intensity that made Matthew feel like the most interesting person in the world. She asked thoughtful questions, made connections he hadn't considered, offered perspectives that made him see his own life differently. When she laughed at his stories, it felt like genuine delight rather than polite social response. When she touched his hand during their conversation, it sent electricity through his entire body. That evening at dinner, Emma commented that her father seemed different, more relaxed. Sarah agreed, attributing it to the beach vacation finally working its magic. Matthew smiled and nodded. But inside, he was calculating how many more days they had left in Thailand, how many more afternoons he might have to spend with Villi. The pattern continued for the next 5 days. Every morning Matthew would make excuses to explore alone, and every afternoon he would find Villi on the beach. Their conversations grew deeper, more intimate. She told him about her failed relationship with a man her parents had chosen, how she disappointed them by refusing to settle for a loveless marriage. Matthew told her about the growing distance in his own marriage, how he and Sarah had become more like business partners than lovers, managing their children's schedules and their social obligations, but rarely connecting on any meaningful level. Villi never pushed for these revelations, never asked probing questions about his marriage or his feelings. She simply listened with that same focused attention she gave to her sketches, creating a space where Matthew felt safe to examine his own dissatisfaction for the first time in years. On their second-to-last day in Thailand, Villi suggested they meet somewhere other than the beach. She knew a small cafe in town, she said, where they could have real Thai food and continue their conversations without the distraction of resort tourists wandering by. Matthew knew this was a line he shouldn't cross, knew that meeting her away from the beach made their relationship something different, something that couldn't be explained as casual vacation encounters. He went anyway. The cafe was exactly as she described, tiny and authentic, with plastic chairs and handwritten menus, and food that tasted nothing like the resort's sanitized version of Thai cuisine. Villi seemed different there, more relaxed, more herself. She introduced him to the elderly owner in rapid Thai, and Matthew caught enough of their conversation to understand she was explaining him as a friend, an architect from America who appreciated real culture. After lunch, she walked him through the local market, pointing out ingredients he'd never seen, explaining customs and traditions with the pride of someone sharing her deepest treasures. Matthew bought a small carved elephant for Emma and a traditional shirt for Jake. But mostly, he just watched Villi move through her world with grace and confidence. When she invited him to see her small apartment, Matthew's rational mind screamed warnings that he chose to ignore. The apartment was tiny but immaculate, filled with her sketches and paintings, books about art and architecture, borrowed from the library, and a small altar with photos of her family. It was the home of someone who had very little money, but infinite care for the things that mattered to her. They sat on her small couch, drinking tea, and Vilai showed him her portfolio, drawings and paintings that revealed genuine talent and years of dedicated practice. Matthew found himself imagining what she could accomplish with proper training, with the opportunities that his own privileged life had always provided. He found himself wanting to be part of making those opportunities possible. When she kissed him, it felt like the most natural thing in the world and the most shocking event of his life. Matthew hadn't kissed anyone but Sarah in over 20 years, hadn't felt the electric thrill of new attraction since he was younger than Vilai was now. For a moment that stretched into eternity, he allowed himself to feel alive in a way he'd forgotten was possible. Then reality crashed back in. He was a married man with children, a respected member of his community, a person who had built his entire identity on being reliable, trustworthy, stable. He was having an affair with a woman young enough to be his daughter, in a foreign country where he understood neither the language nor the customs nor the consequences of his actions. Matthew pulled away, apologizing frantically, explaining about his family, his responsibilities, his complete inability to offer her anything real or lasting. Vilai listened calmly, then told him something that would echo in his mind for months afterward. She said she understood that he wasn't free, but that didn't make the connection between them any less real. She said she could see that he was drowning in a life that didn't fit him anymore, and that sometimes people needed to nearly drown before they learned how to swim. The next day was their last in Thailand, and Matthew couldn't bring himself to see Vilai again. He spent it with his family, taking final photos, buying last-minute souvenirs, playing the role of devoted father and husband with desperate intensity. But even as he smiled for Sarah's camera and listened to Jake's complaints about having to leave, part of his mind was calculating flight schedules, imagining reasons to return to Thailand, fantasizing about a different life entirely. On the flight home, Matthew stared out the airplane window at the shrinking coastline and felt like he was leaving part of himself behind. Sarah slept beside him, exhausted from 2 weeks of managed family fun, and the kids had their headphones on, lost in their separate digital worlds. Matthew had never felt more alone in his life, and the loneliness felt like a revelation rather than a problem to be solved. But Vilai had given him her email address. The first message Matthew sent was carefully casual, thanking her for showing him the real Thailand, for being such a gracious guide to her culture. Her response came within hours, warm and friendly, but nothing that couldn't have been shared with Sarah if necessary. They began corresponding about art and architecture, sharing photos and ideas, maintaining the fiction that theirs was an intellectual friendship between people who shared creative interests. Gradually, inevitably, the messages became more personal. Vilai wrote about her loneliness, her frustration with her limited opportunities, her dreams that seemed impossible from her small apartment in Surat Thani. Matthew wrote about his growing sense of being trapped, his marriage that felt more like a business partnership, his children who barely seemed to need him anymore. Neither of them mentioned the kiss, but it hung between every word they exchanged, a promise of possibility that made Matthew's carefully constructed life feel increasingly unbearable. 3 months after returning from Thailand, Matthew made a decision that would destroy everything he'd spent his adult life building. He booked a return trip to Thailand, telling Sarah it was a solo research expedition for a potential international project. She was supportive, even encouraging, proud of her husband's expanding professional horizons. Matthew had never lied to his wife about anything more serious than forgetting to take out the garbage. The deception required to book flights, arrange hotels, and create a fictional work itinerary felt like learning a new language, one that made him sick to speak, but impossible to stop using. When he landed in Bangkok and took the connecting flight to Surat Thani, Matthew felt like he was waking up from a 3-month coma. The humid air, the chaotic energy, the sensory overload that had exhausted him during the family vacation now felt like coming home to a life he was meant to live. Will met him at the small airport, and seeing her again after months of email exchanges felt like a physical shock. She seemed smaller than he remembered, but also more vibrant, more real than anyone in his Seattle life had appeared in months. When she hugged him, Matthew felt every careful wall he'd built around his emotions crumble completely. The week they spent together was unlike anything Matthew had experienced in his 52 years of life. They talked for hours, made love with a passion that reminded him he had a body capable of pleasure, explored temples and markets and hidden beaches where they were the only tourists for miles. Vilai introduced him to her friends, young artists and teachers who welcomed him with genuine warmth and treated their relationship as perfectly natural rather than scandalous. For 7 days, Matthew lived as the person he might have been if he'd made different choices, if he'd prioritized passion over security, adventure over respectability. He felt creative in ways he hadn't since college, taking photographs and making sketches, seeing the world through Vilai's artist's eyes rather than his architect's practical vision. But he also saw things that his rational mind tried to categorize and understand. Vilai's apartment was even smaller than he'd remembered, her financial situation more precarious. She mentioned struggling to pay rent, worrying about her family's medical bills, dreaming of opportunities that required money she didn't have. Matthew found himself wanting to solve these problems, to use his resources to make her dreams possible. When he offered to help with her rent, Vilai initially refused, insisting she didn't want charity from him. But when Matthew explained, it wasn't charity, but investment in their relationship, a way for him to feel useful and connected to her life even when they were apart, she accepted with tears of gratitude that made his heart ache. Before he left Thailand the second time, Matthew had transferred $5,000 to Vilai's account and promised to return in 2 months. He'd also begun researching art schools in Europe, imagining how he could fund her education, how they could build a future together that honored both her dreams and his need to escape his suffocating American life. The return to Seattle felt like diving underwater after breathing freely for a week. Everything seemed muted, colorless, artificially controlled. Sarah's cheerful questions about his trip felt like interrogation. His children's casual indifference to his presence felt like rejection. His office, his projects, his entire professional life felt like elaborate stage sets for a play he no longer wanted to perform. Matthew threw himself into his correspondence with Vilai with desperate intensity. Their daily email exchanges became his primary source of joy, and her photos and updates from Thailand felt more real than his actual surroundings. When she mentioned her brother's university fees or her mother's medical expenses, Matthew found reasons to send money, telling himself He was investing in their shared future. The financial transfers started small and occasional, but grew larger and more frequent. $1,000 for her brother's textbooks, 1,500 for her mother's surgery, 3,000 for a deposit on a better apartment closer to her teaching job. Each transaction felt meaningful, a way for Matthew to bridge the distance between them and prove his commitment to their relationship. Sarah noticed her husband's changed mood, but attributed it to work stress and perhaps a midlife crisis that would resolve itself with time and patience. She encouraged him to take more solo trips if they helped him relax, never suspecting that her husband's increased happiness correlated directly with his plans to abandon their marriage. If you're thinking this story is heading somewhere dark, you're absolutely right. And if you think Matthew should have seen the warning signs, well, you're right about that too. But here's the thing about falling in love at 52 after 20 years of marriage. Sometimes your judgment gets clouded by emotions you'd forgotten you were capable of feeling. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel and leave a comment about whether you've ever seen something like this happen to someone you know. Because Matthew's story is far from over, and it's about to get much worse. Matthew's third trip to Thailand was supposed to be the beginning of his new life. He'd been making increasingly elaborate plans, researching divorce attorneys, calculating asset divisions, imagining how to explain to Emma and Jake that their father was leaving their mother for a woman barely older than Emma herself. The guilt was eating him alive. But so was the thought of spending the rest of his life in a marriage that felt like a beautifully appointed tomb. This time he stayed for 2 weeks, and the cracks in paradise began to show almost immediately. Vilai seemed stressed in ways she hadn't been before, distracted and sometimes short-tempered. She mentioned problems with her landlord, issues with her teaching job, family pressures that required constant attention. Matthew found himself spending most of their time together, solving her problems rather than enjoying her company. There were also things that didn't quite add up, details that shifted between conversations, explanations that seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous. When Matthew asked to meet her family, Vilai always had reasons why the timing wasn't right. When he suggested they take a trip together to Bangkok or another province, she found excuses to stay close to home. But Matthew's emotional investment was too deep for rational analysis. Every doubt he experienced was overwhelmed by Vilai's tears of gratitude when he solved another financial crisis, by her passionate declarations of love, by her detailed plans for their future together. She spoke of coming to America, of marrying him once his divorce was final, of building a life that combined his stability with her artistic passion. The money requests were becoming larger and more frequent. Her father needed surgery. Her brother had been accepted to a more expensive university program. Her teaching position was in jeopardy unless she could pay a bribe to the administrator. Each crisis seemed urgent and legitimate, and Matthew's desire to prove his love made questioning these needs feel petty and suspicious. By the time Matthew returned to Seattle from his third trip, he had transferred over $30,000 to various accounts Vilai had provided, money taken from his business reserves and personal savings without Sarah's knowledge. He had also made a decision that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. He was going to ask Sarah for a divorce when she returned from visiting her sister in Portland. The conversation with Sarah was the hardest thing Matthew had ever done. She listened with growing horror as he explained that he wasn't happy, hadn't been happy for years, needed to find himself before it was too late. He didn't mention Vilai, couldn't bear to add betrayal to the abandonment he was already inflicting. But Sarah's questions made it clear she suspected another woman was involved. The weeks that followed were a nightmare of lawyers and logistics, of Emma's tears and Jake's furious accusations, of friends choosing sides and business partners expressing concern about Matthew's judgment. Sarah maintained a dignity that made Matthew's guilt even more unbearable, agreeing to mediation rather than warfare, protecting the children from the worst details of their father's midlife meltdown. Through it all, Matthew's correspondence with Vilai intensified. She became his lifeline during the darkest days, offering comfort and understanding when everyone else in his life was treating him like a stranger. Her messages arrived at perfect moments, filled with love and encouragement and promises of the beautiful life they would build together once he was free. But freedom came with a price Matthew hadn't anticipated. The divorce settlement left him with roughly half of his previous assets, and his business partners made it clear that his judgment was no longer trusted. Several major clients had withdrawn their projects, apparently uncomfortable with Matthew's personal instability affecting their professional relationship. Meanwhile, Vilai's financial needs had escalated dramatically. Her family was facing eviction, she explained, and needed $15,000 immediately to avoid losing their home. Her teaching job had been eliminated due to budget cuts, and she needed money to survive while looking for new employment. Most urgently, she had been accepted to an art program in London, but needed $25,000 for tuition and living expenses to begin classes in 3 months. Matthew liquidated his retirement accounts to meet these needs, telling himself this was an investment in their future together, that once Vilai was established in her career, they would both benefit from her success. He also began making concrete plans to move to Thailand, selling his remaining assets and preparing to start over completely in a country where his professional credentials meant nothing but where love would sustain them both. The fourth trip to Thailand was supposed to be permanent. Matthew had sold his car, terminated his apartment lease, and packed his entire remaining life into 2 suitcases. He carried a cashier's check for $50,000, the last of his accessible money, intended to set up their life together and fund Vilai's London education. Vilai met him at the airport as usual, but something was different. She seemed nervous, distracted, less physically affectionate than during his previous visits. She explained that she was stressed about the London program, worried about leaving Thailand, overwhelmed by the major life changes they were both making. They went to her apartment, which Matthew noticed was in a different location than before, smaller and more run down. When he asked about the move, Vilai explained that her previous landlord had sold the building, forcing all tenants to relocate quickly. The explanation made sense, but Matthew felt a nagging unease he couldn't quite identify. Over the next few days, Matthew's unease grew into active concern. Vilai was often absent, claiming to handle paperwork for her visa application or meet with education consultants about the London program. When they were together, she seemed distracted, checking her phone constantly, making excuses to step outside for private phone calls. Matthew also began noticing details that contradicted things Vilai had told him over the past year. The neighborhood where her family supposedly lived wasn't where she directed their taxi when they went to buy groceries. The school, where she claimed to have taught, had no record of her employment when Matthew stopped by to introduce himself. The art supplies in her apartment were cheap and barely used, despite her claims of spending hours daily on her portfolio. The revelation came accidentally, as these things often do. Matthew was using Vilai's laptop to check his email when a message notification popped up from a man named David, written in English, expressing concern about when she would return to Bangkok and asking whether the American was still paying for everything. The message included references to other men, other ongoing relationships, other sources of income that had nothing to do with teaching or art. Matthew's hands shook as he navigated through Vilai's email account, finding months of correspondence with multiple foreign men, each apparently believing he was in an exclusive relationship with her, each sending money for various fabricated emergencies and expenses. There were detailed spreadsheets tracking payments received, emotional manipulation strategies that worked best with different personality types, and group messages with other women sharing techniques for extracting maximum financial benefit from lonely Western men. The woman Matthew had fallen in love with, had sacrificed his marriage and his financial security for, had abandoned his children for, existed only in carefully crafted emails, and performed interactions designed to separate him from his money as efficiently as possible. When Vilai returned to the apartment that evening, she found Matthew sitting at her kitchen table with printouts of her emails spread before him like evidence in a criminal trial. Her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, resignation, and finally, a cold indifference that Matthew had never seen before. She didn't deny anything. Instead, she explained the situation with a matter-of-fact tone that made Matthew's blood freeze. Yes, she had multiple foreign boyfriends who sent her money. Yes, the emergencies and family crises had been fabricated. Yes, the art school acceptance and London program were complete fiction. No, she had never loved him or intended to build a life with him. What she offered instead was a business proposition. Matthew could continue their arrangement, understanding now that it was transactional rather than romantic. Or he could leave Thailand immediately and never contact her again. If he chose the latter option and remained quiet about their relationship, she would return $10,000 of the money he'd sent. If he caused problems or tried to expose her operation, she would ensure that evidence of their relationship reached his ex-wife and children, along with details that would destroy what remained of his reputation in Seattle. Matthew's response was not what Vilai expected. Instead of anger or threats or desperate attempts to salvage their relationship, he began laughing. Not the bitter laughter of a broken man, but something deeper and more complex. He laughed because he realized that for the first time in months, possibly years, someone was telling him the complete truth about something important. The woman he'd fallen in love with was indeed fictional, but the man who had fallen for her was real. And that man had been suffocating in his previous life long before Vilai appeared to help him destroy it. Matthew took the $10,000 Vilai offered, not because he needed her money, but because accepting it felt like closing a business transaction that should never have been confused with love. He also told her that he wouldn't expose her operation, not because of her threats, but because he had no interest in revenge against someone who had simply been more honest about using him than he had been about using his marriage as an escape from his own dissatisfaction. The flight back to Seattle was the longest 12 hours of Matthew's life. He was returning as a completely different person than the one who had left, financially ruined, professionally damaged, estranged from his children, and carrying the knowledge that he had destroyed his life for a woman who had never existed. But he was also returning with a clarity about himself and his choices that he'd never possessed before. Sarah had moved on during his absence, not to another relationship, but to a life that no longer included space for his chaos and self-destruction. Emma was furious, and Jake was heartbroken, both convinced that their father had chosen a stranger over his own family. Matthew's business was effectively finished, his professional reputation destroyed by months of erratic behavior and abandoned responsibilities. But something unexpected began happening during Matthew's first months back in Seattle. The complete destruction of his previous life, rather than crushing him, began to feel like freedom. Without the weight of maintaining appearances, managing other people's expectations, or pretending to be satisfied with a life that had never fit him properly. Matthew began to discover who he actually was when stripped of all external definitions. He took a job with a small non-profit organization that designed affordable housing, work that paid a fraction of his previous income, but engaged his creativity in ways he'd forgotten were possible. He rented a tiny apartment in a neighborhood he'd never considered before, surrounded by artists and students and people who measured success in ways that had nothing to do with square footage or luxury car brands. Most importantly, Matthew began the slow, painful process of rebuilding relationships with Emma and Jake. It took months of consistent effort, of showing up when he said he would, of listening to their anger without defending himself, of proving through actions rather than words that he was committed to being their father, regardless of whether they were ready to forgive him. The reconciliation with his children happened gradually, in small moments that accumulated into trust. Emma's first genuine smile in over a year when Matthew helped her with a college application essay. Jake's grudging admission that his father seemed happier, more like himself, than he had in years. Sarah's acknowledgement that while she couldn't forgive Matthew's methods, she could see that his destructive choices had led him to a life that actually suited him. 2 years after returning from Thailand, Matthew received a message from David, the man whose email had first revealed Vilay's deception. David had discovered the truth about his own relationship with Vilay, had found Matthew's contact information, and was seeking advice about how to recover from similar devastation. Matthew spent 3 hours on the phone with David, listening to a story that was simultaneously identical to and completely different from his own. That conversation led to others, as word spread through various online communities about Matthew's experience and his willingness to help other men who had fallen victim to similar schemes. Matthew began volunteering with organizations that educated people about romance fraud, speaking at seminars and support groups about the psychology of vulnerability and the process of recovery. He discovered that his story, while uniquely painful, was part of a much larger pattern. Lonely people of all ages and backgrounds were being targeted by increasingly sophisticated operations that exploited genuine human needs for connection and purpose. The shame and isolation that victims experienced often prevented them from seeking help or even acknowledging what had happened to them. Matthew's work helping other fraud victims became a source of meaning that his previous career had never provided. He learned to speak about his experience without minimizing his own responsibility, while also acknowledging the skill with which he had been manipulated. He helped other people navigate the complex emotions of grief for relationships that had never been real, anger at themselves for being fooled, and the challenge of trusting again after such profound betrayal. 3 years after his return from Thailand, at a conference about financial fraud prevention, Matthew met Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychologist who specialized in treating victims of romance scams. Their friendship developed slowly, built on shared professional interests and mutual respect, rather than the desperate emotional hunger that had made Matthew vulnerable to Willai's manipulation. Sarah Chen was nothing like the fantasy woman Matthew had fallen for in Thailand. She was his age, with teenage children of her own, a demanding career, and no interest in being rescued or in rescuing anyone else. Their relationship developed through long conversations about work and books and the challenges of single parenting, through shared meals that no one had to pay for secretly, through a gradual recognition that they enjoyed each other's company without needing to solve each other's problems. When Matthew told Dr. Chen about his experience with Willai, she listened with professional interest rather than judgment. She helped him understand the psychological techniques that had been used against him, the way skilled manipulators identify and exploit specific vulnerabilities, the difference between being naive and being human. More importantly, she helped him see that his capacity for love and generosity, while exploited, were not character flaws to be ashamed of, but strengths that needed better boundaries. Matthew's relationship with Dr. Chen never became romantic, but it became something equally valuable, a model for what healthy connection looked like between two people who had both experienced significant loss and were committed to building something real rather than something that simply filled emotional voids. By the 5th anniversary of his return from Thailand, Matthew had created a life that bore no resemblance to either his previous existence or the fantasy he had pursued with Willai. He lived modestly, but with genuine contentment, worked on projects that mattered to him, maintained close relationships with his adult children, and had learned to distinguish between loneliness and solitude, between love and dependency. Emma had graduated college and was working for an environmental organization, a career choice Matthew had supported enthusiastically, even when Sarah worried about the financial prospects. Jake was studying engineering with plans to design sustainable infrastructure. Inspired partly by conversations with his father about architecture as social responsibility, both children had forgiven Matthew not because he deserved it, but because they had chosen to value their relationship with the person he had become over their anger about the choices he had made. The most surprising development was Matthew's relationship with Sarah, his ex-wife. While they would never reconcile romantically, they had developed a friendship based on their shared commitment to their children and their mutual recognition that Matthew's destructive choices had paradoxically led both of them to better lives. Sarah had used her divorce settlement to travel and pursue interests she'd deferred during 20 years of marriage, and she often said that Matthew leaving had forced her to discover her own independence in ways she never would have chosen but now treasured. On a rainy Thursday evening in November, exactly 5 years after his final return from Thailand, Matthew was reviewing applications for a fraud prevention grant when he received an email that made his heart skip several beats. The sender's name was Vilai, and the subject line read simply, "Thank you." For several minutes, Matthew stared at the unopened message, experiencing an echo of the excitement and anxiety that her communications had once triggered. Then he opened it and read something he had never expected to receive. Vilai wrote that she had been thinking about him recently, not because she wanted anything, but because she had made significant changes in her own life that made her reflect on their past interaction differently. She had left the romance fraud operation 2 years earlier, she explained, after a situation with another victim had escalated dangerously and forced her to confront the real harm her activities were causing. She had used the money she'd accumulated, including contributions from Matthew and others, to genuinely enroll in business school in Bangkok, where she was now studying nonprofit management with plans to work in organizations that helped rural communities develop sustainable economic opportunities. She had also begun volunteering with groups that educated young people about the dangers of engaging in online fraud, sharing her insider knowledge to help prevent others from making her choices. Vilai's message included no request for forgiveness, no attempt to justify her previous actions, and no suggestion that they should resume contact. Instead, she simply wanted Matthew to know that their interaction, while based on deception, had led her to examine her own life in ways that ultimately resulted in genuine positive change. She had heard through mutual contacts about Matthew's work helping fraud victims, and she wanted him to know that she respected what he was doing and understood it as a form of healing that benefited many people. The message ended with information about the non-profit organization where Vilai now worked, documenting their efforts to provide legitimate opportunities for young people in rural Thailand who might otherwise be vulnerable to recruitment by fraud operations. She suggested that if Matthew ever wanted to support anti-fraud education efforts in Thailand, her organization would be a reliable channel for such contributions, though she emphasized that she was sharing this information as a professional resource rather than a personal request. Matthew read the message 3 times, each reading revealing different layers of meaning and emotion. His first impulse was skepticism, wondering whether this was simply a more sophisticated manipulation designed to extract money or sympathy. His second response was anger, resentment that Vilai felt entitled to contact him at all after the damage she had caused. But his third and final reaction was something closer to gratitude. The woman who had written this message was not the fictional character he had fallen in love with, but she was also not the cold manipulator who had revealed the truth of their relationship 5 years earlier. She was someone who had made destructive choices, experienced consequences, and used those experiences to create something better. Exactly as Matthew had done. Matthew never replied to Vilai's message, but he did research her organization and eventually made an anonymous donation to their fraud prevention education program. He thought of it not as closure, but as completion, a way to ensure that their interaction, which had begun in deception and caused genuine harm, ultimately contributed to preventing similar damage to others. 6 months later, at a conference in Portland about financial crime prevention, Matthew was approached by a young man named Jake, who worked for an organization combating romance fraud in Southeast Asia. Jake mentioned that he'd heard about Matthew's story and wanted to thank him for his advocacy work, which had helped his organization secure funding for education programs in rural communities. During their conversation, Jake mentioned that some of the most effective anti-fraud educators were former perpetrators who could speak authentically about the techniques and psychology involved in these operations. He described a particular presentation he'd attended where a young woman from Thailand had given a powerful talk about her experience recruiting and manipulating victims. Her decision to leave that work and her current efforts to prevent others from following similar paths. Jake didn't mention the presenter's name, and Matthew didn't ask, but he recognized the work Wilai had described in her email. The knowledge that she was genuinely contributing to solutions rather than just avoiding consequences gave Matthew a sense of completion he hadn't expected to achieve. As Matthew walked back to his hotel after the conference, he reflected on the strange trajectory that had brought him from a suffocating marriage to financial ruin to a life of purpose he never could have imagined. The 5 years since Thailand had taught him that transformation was possible at any age, that devastating mistakes could become the foundation for wisdom, and that the capacity for love that had made him vulnerable to manipulation was the same capacity that now allowed him to help others navigate similar challenges. Matthew's story doesn't have a traditional happy ending because real life rarely provides the neat resolutions that stories promise. He never recovered the money he lost or rebuilt the financial security he'd sacrificed. His relationship with his children, while strong, still carried traces of the pain his choices had caused them. His professional reputation never fully recovered from the chaos of his midlife crisis. But Matthew had something more valuable than money or reputation or even the approval of his children, though he treasured that above everything else. He had learned to distinguish between the life he thought he was supposed to want and the life that actually brought him satisfaction. He had discovered that being useful to other people was more fulfilling than being successful by conventional measures. He had found that genuine connection was possible even after profound betrayal, and the trust could be rebuilt through consistent actions rather than passionate declarations. Most importantly, Matthew had learned that vulnerability was not a weakness to be eliminated, but a human condition to be managed wisely. The emotional hunger that had made him susceptible to Wilai's manipulation was the same openness that allowed him to connect meaningfully with fraud victims who needed someone who understood their experience without judgment. If you've listened to this story and recognized yourself or someone you love in Matthew's experience, know that transformation is possible regardless of how complete the devastation feels. The shame and isolation that fraud victims experience is part of the manipulation designed to prevent them from seeking help or rebuilding their lives. Matthew's journey from successful architect to romance fraud victim to advocate and educator proves that our worst mistakes can become the source of our most meaningful contributions to the world. If we're willing to do the difficult work of honest self-examination and consistent effort to create something better from the wreckage of our previous lives. The saddest part of Matthew's story isn't the money he lost or even the marriage he destroyed. It's how many people are experiencing similar isolation and vulnerability right now. Targets for sophisticated operations that profit from human loneliness. But the most hopeful part of his story is how that same vulnerability when channeled toward helping others, becomes a source of strength and purpose that no amount of conventional success could provide. If this story resonated with you, make sure you're subscribed to this channel because we share real stories about real people navigating the complexities of modern life. Leave a comment about your own experiences with online relationships, whether positive or cautionary, because your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And if you know someone who might be vulnerable to romance fraud or is currently experiencing something similar, share this story with them, not as judgment, but as evidence that recovery and transformation are possible even after the most devastating mistakes. Human connection is one of our deepest needs, but it's also one of our greatest vulnerabilities. Matthew's story reminds us that the same capacity for love that can lead us into dangerous territory is also what allows us to build meaningful lives and help others avoid similar pitfalls. The choice between wisdom and bitterness, between isolation and connection, between shame and service, is one we make every day. And it's never too late to choose the path that leads toward healing rather than further damage.